The 2.0 is a significantly wider chassis. Hello folks, welcome to Netcruzer RC. Got a new Tekno. Let's talk about this build. So yeah, this is a Tekno RC EB48 2.0. Now, I recorded some clips while I was building it, but I got busy getting prepared for the races that were coming up, and I have now since raced this. For 2021, personally, John Kennedy, I am a sponsored Tekno RC driver. So I just want to mention that before we get too deep into the build. I just want to talk about the build, the quality, the steps. We're going to go through step by step through the book as I've taken some clips along the way of building this. As you're probably already noticing it, I've already got a qualification sticker on here, and you're probably seeing some dirt and some scrapes and stuff. I've already raced this at two fairly big race events, the J Concepts Championship 2021 Outdoor Championship and at Bego Race Series 1 out of a 5-part series for 2021, and I'm heading out today to do round 2. So you will see those videos eventually. I'm catching up on them. You've already seen the J Concepts race, so you've already seen this on track running around, but I haven't done the official introduction to this car yet on my channel. So I just want to go through that. Before we start doing the step-by-step, I'm just going to briefly talk to you about the electronics that I put into it. As always, I'm running a Genzace battery. Huge thanks to Genzace for supporting the channel. This is a Genzace Redline 6000 4S hardcase 130C LiPo high voltage battery. But on this side is where all the electronic goodies are. This is a Hobbywing XR8 SCT, and this is a new Hobbywing Gen 3 1900 kV motor. And the receiver box is back here, the transponder's on top. The reason why the transponder is on top and angled is because the way the body is shaped, you do need to do that, or else you will run into an interference problem where it will hit the back of the shell. So just, that's a little tip. As I go through this video, I'm not going to be criticizing anything, but I am going to give some tips. Okay, let's just start going through the build. Step 1, bag A, step 1, building out all the differentials. So you start with building out the center diff, and it takes 10,000 CST diff oil. If you're coming from an older EB48, I want you to be aware that the center diff cup is significantly larger. Now, I knew that going in, but I also didn't really think about that my old spur gears would not be compatible. So I had some older spur gears from my old EB48.3 that I thought I could use as spares. They do not fit because the can size of the actual diff cup has changed. If you do want to get some additional spurs for spares in the future or switch to the metal one in the future, you do need to buy new 2.0 sized spur gears. Bag B is the front and rear differentials, and for those you're building out a very similar way to almost all other Tekno vehicles I've ever built. Very high quality components. The front diff gets 10,000 CST weight diff oil, and the rear diff gets 7,000 weight diff oil. Then in bag C, we're on to building the front gearbox assembly and mounting on the front shock tower. Now, the front gearbox assembly, as you put the front diff in, there are some shims. I did not have to run any shims. Check it as you're doing it, because you do get, they do provide you some little metal shims that you can use to shim your diffs, but you likely don't need them. So just be aware of that. Check the fitment. If there's not a significant amount of play back and forth, you don't need to put diff shims in, so don't bother, because that would just bind everything up. As you mount the front shock tower, you're putting on the new shock top standoffs. Now these shock standoffs are more metallic, they have more metal in them than the old ones, very much similar to how the EB410 to the 4.2 added a bit more metal to the posts, and then they added those little bushings on the end of the shock caps to get the perfect amount of play without having to crank down the nuts. Then we're on to bag D, which is installing and building the rear gearbox. So very similar process to how you built the front. They're different, but they're very similar to each other. So just carefully look at all the same steps, build it the same way. You're also installing the wing mount on the rear. This is a big piece. It's almost structural the way it goes through that rear gearbox and mounts to the shock tower. So just be aware of the size of the screws, because there is a slight difference to the size of the screws depending on what holes you're putting them in. And just, you know, take your time with the build, make sure you're doing it appropriately. Then we're on to bag E, which is building at the rear end assembly, getting the hinge pin blocks ready, putting the rear sway bars in. Now the rear sway, I thought this was interesting, that the rear sway bars, they run on bearings. So normally you have to be careful about setting the adjustment on your sway bar to make sure that it's tight but has a little bit of play to it. On this new Tekno, you don't have to worry about that at all, because it runs on bearings. So there's bearings that sit inside of this mount, and then there's a little plastic piece that just clips on over it, and then you tighten that down. And so the rod itself is always riding within a bearing, so you don't have to worry about the rod binding up, and you can tighten your grub screws down completely on your sway bars. Definitely tighten them down, because after a couple of races, as I mentioned, I have raced this a couple times, the little plastic standoffs did kind of pop out a bit, so just make sure that you've got those cranked down well, because there's a lot of flex, you know, there's a lot of movement on that. Stock C blocks and D blocks, very high quality metals. I built this all out to be kit spec. I did build it out using the inserts that they show to use. So I'm on the full factory geometry with this kit. I didn't really change anything except for after the second race event. I did change the front spring rate. So you're building at most of the rear end first. Bag F is the rear carrier assembly. It's a pretty beefy part. Well, the whole car is beefy. So the rear carrier assembly, it's a double nutted, fully captured assembly. There's a lot of adjustments here. So you have inserts on bottom, and then there's adjustment on top. And that sets some of the adjustment on that. Again, I built this all out to be kit spec geometry. There is a wheelbase adjustment as you're putting this rear. Currently got it set in short wheelbase configuration, so all of the shims are on the rear, which brings the axle the most forward. Depending on the size of your track, that's where you adjust that, or your driving style. Then bag F, we're on to the turnbuckle links. So standard turnbuckle link assembly. It's good to use a good quality tool, or a shock tool also works for holding on to the rod ends while you're running them in, because there's a lot of plastic here. It's a big threaded rod, and there's a lot of plastic, so there's a lot of friction. So lube it up while you're screwing it together. And for the positioning, you get a lot of positions. There's 10 positions for roll center on the inside, and on the outside you have 3. Just be aware of the stock ask for setup, and you can adjust it later as you decide what works best. Something I do really like is that the rear of the gearbox, new on the 2.0, it's a universal. Old car used to have a little itty bitty dog bone. 2.0, it's a universal joint on the rear, so it's always connected, which makes it easy for when you want to do servicing, take your diff out and stuff. Your rear drive shaft always stays in place, and the front one is the long one you can just take out. Bag G, front end assembly, same thing as mentioned, sway bars, similar system to the sway bar system, just it's got the bearings, just make sure that's tightened in properly. The front and rear B blocks and A blocks, and then the bumper. Be careful when you're doing this, because that front bumper screw, if you're not paying attention and you put that front bumper on before it goes through the chassis, that screw could go a little bit too far and damage the bottom of that front gearbox assembly. So just be aware that it shows you putting the front bumper on in step C4. I don't think you need to. Wait until you're actually going to put the gearbox onto the chassis, because you have to take that off anyway. So be aware of that. Bag H is the front spindle assembly. This is where I think is one of the most unique and best things about the EB48 2.0, as well as the ET48 2.0, is the way that they've done their front end. I've always liked the Teknos do not use pivot balls or pillow ball type suspension in the front. It uses a type of a C-block style front end assembly, and this is metal. So with the plastic knuckle, but the plastic knuckle is very beefy and there's a lot of material there. These two little grub screws, there's a lot of things going on here. So you've got two kingpin assemblies and then they're held in by little grubs through the plastic, but also this hinge pin assembly that goes through here is keyed, and these are not nutted, so they just press in and then they're held in by a little grub screw. A tip for that is definitely make sure you degrease and Loctite this little grub screw which holds that hinge pin in. And then as an extra tip, I learned this from another TEKNO RC racer after running this a little bit and noticing they were loosening off a little bit, is put some shoe goo over it. Shoe goo just covering over those holes, which just stops it from being able to loosen out. It's just a quick little tip. Now you're only putting that on the outside, like build it all and then put a little dab of shoe goo over the holes. That's going to just glue it in place, and then if you need to service it later you can peel it off. That's why you want to use shoe goo, is because it turns into like a rubbery kind of consistency and you can peel it off after. Then bag H is the front camber links and the steering links. And the stock positioning, again, more adjustments for the stock positioning, so be aware of all this stuff on how you can build that out. Then we're on the bag I, the steering assembly. Now the steering assembly has a couple of options. You can choose to run no servo saver at all. This piece is the no saver option, this one is with the saver. Now they're asking for you to tighten it up and then loosen it off 2 full turns. I found that that is a little bit too loose for a big RC track. I've been racing this on fairly big 8-scale tracks. So now I'm just doing it fully tight, loosen it off 1/4 of a turn. So I'm running it almost fully locked. So by having the servo saber tightened down, you get that steering response after a full compression. Pay attention to the position of the front Ackerman bar because the orientation of this matters. We're on to bag J, which is this front kind of bulkhead brace assembly, and this clamps the whole bell crank system down to the chassis. Then we're on to bag K, which is actually taking these whole front end and rear end assemblies and putting them onto the chassis itself. The chassis is a 4mm piece of 70-75 aluminum. At least I think it's 4mm. It's thick. That's a thick boy, and it's a really nice piece. It has some lightning scallops on the inside, but everything kind of keys in. The A and B blocks, they kind of click into place, and then the front bumper, that's why I recommend you don't put the front bumper on, because you have to loosen off anyway to kind of click the front end on. Then you kind of sandwich it all together and put that center screw in, which locks that front end onto the chassis, along with the 6 screws that are on the bottom. There are these 2 little ones that are on the outside, so they're mostly 2.5mm big screws, but there's these 2 little ones also are on here for a little bit extra support as well. Pay attention to all the sizing, because 2 of the out of the 2.5mm screws that you use, 2 of them are longer than the other 2. So there is a 20 mils go on the front and the 15 mils go on the rear, and then it's the opposite on the rear. So the 20 mils are on the rear and the 15 mils are on the front. So just be aware of that. You don't want to put in the 2 long screws in the wrong position, because that could go through and damage. Then continuing on to bag K, we're onto this rear end assembly, which is this support system, which goes through on a little mount, which allows for a floating, not really floating, but a pivoting rear body mount. And that also gives you some tuning options here, where you can choose to put different inserts in or take out this brace and do a couple things with tuning the chassis flex. There's also a thing you can do with the battery mount for chassis flex that I'll talk to you when we get there as well. The end of bag K, you've got the front end on, the rear end on, and the center diff is in, the drivetrain is in. Essentially you have a operational chassis, and then we're on the bag L, which is building out the shocks. For the shocks, they recommend a 550 shock oil in the front, 500 shock oil in the rear. Typically, this is a standard racing thing, you want a lighter weight oil in the rear. A lighter weight oil in the rear gives you a little bit more rear traction, and a thicker weight oil in the front gives you a little bit more steering. The quality of the shocks are very good. The building out the shock cartridge assembly, there's a lot of pieces here, little Delrin pieces, the O-rings. I did use some of the 1-Up blue O-ring grease to lubricate the shock cartridges when building it out. I built out the shocks to a fully stock configuration. Pay attention to everything that they recommend for building out your shocks and bleeding them, as they are emulsion based. So they might be a little bit different if you're used to doing a traditional style bleed. The emulsion is a different type of way of doing it, where you kind of want to pump in a bunch of air. While the shock rod is fully extended, undo the emulsion screw, fully collapse it. You'll get a lot of kind of emulsified oil bleed out, wipe it off, put the screw in, and then you end up with a 0 rebound or very little rebound emulsified shock. So you're going to add your shocks to the shock tower, front and rear. The inserts in the bottom are a little bit tight to get in sometimes, and they do have a reverse thread on one side, so pay attention to the color of the screw which goes in the bottom. That's a Tekno thing, where the one on the right side is usually reverse thread, and it just so that when the compression doesn't unscrew the screw for you, the compression doesn't back out the screw. On the rear, the shock towers the springs do hang off the rear of the buggy. Then we're on the bag N, which is starting to do the electronics. There is a plastic tray which sits under here, which holds the ESC and has some cable routing management stuff. So there's some of the servo wire and some of the other ESC wires can get kind of tucked along here. Also, these side rails provide cable management as well. Then bag N, we're on to the battery tray. Now the battery tray system is very elegant, I would say. It just uses this one big strap, 2 plastic pieces on either end. You tighten them down by the big screws on the bottom of the chassis, and it's just one big piece of Velcro. If you feel like that maybe not exactly solid enough for you, if your battery has a lot of lateral play, you can get an upgrade or buy another battery strap, which gives you 2 pieces of battery strap, which gives you a lateral one as well, so that you could have a strap going this way. You don't need it though. And also, the pieces that allow you to run that lateral strap are chassis flex aids. So you can see it right here. Those are optional. You can choose to have them, which does make it so your battery can't slip around, but also you can put the strap through them. If you want more chassis flex, you take those out. And then that would allow the center of the chassis to have a bit more flex for a loose type of surface where you want to get more mechanical traction. More flex is more traction, less flex is less traction. At least that's my understanding of it. Then bag N, you're going to add the little plastic side rails to the chassis. Those also add to the cable management aspect of it. And then step N6, you're going to install the motor mount assembly, which is a sliding motor mount, and you're going to get your motor all meshed in with your spur gear. I did mention from the first race that I had a real big problem with my Pinion, with the pinion that I chose a Traxxas X-Max pinion. Do not do that. It's too big. The shoulder will interfere with the motor mount, and that's how I ran into this situation where I've got this completely mashed up motor mount because the pinion screw was grazing against this motor mount, and then it got jammed in there, and then I damaged my motor shaft. And now this whole thing, I just chose to replace it all because in the bashing that I had to do to get it off and fixed, I actually damaged the sliding mechanism where this is all kind of mashed up. This was totally my fault. I have since replaced all of this, so it's got a brand new motor mount on there. I didn't have to do that. I just did that for cosmetic reasons and for setting the mesh properly because it is a sliding mechanism and a millimeter of binding. Once you get everything on there, even though I can move it here offload, that final adjustment is really tight because it got bent up. And anyway, it was just causing me some problems, so I just decided to replace the whole thing. That's the nice thing about these race cars, very modular, easy to get parts, swap out things that get damaged or worn as you're racing. Then Bego, we're nearing the very final assembly here, which is the very last thing is just to add the little steering link which connects your servo rod to the steering bell cranks. And just pay attention to the geometry that they show you of how you want the geometry to be set up for the angle of your servo, because that matters. And then bag P is mount on the wing to the big wing mount. Something I was kind of surprised of, it is nutted. So there's little nuts you have to insert into the side of the rear of this wing mount, and then you screw down into them. So you're not screwing into the plastic, you're screwing into lock nuts. And so this wing is very secure. You're almost never going to lose the wing. What's going to happen is you're going to break the wing eventually, and then you can just replace it. But the likelihood of you stripping out the wing and having the wing come off from stripped out screws is, I would say, almost impossible based on this design. And the TEKNO wing, the new ones, now have kind of like golf ball dimpling on the backside, which aids in aerodynamics. Then after you've got the wing mounted on, there's really nothing left to do other than just make sure your electronics are all done. Now, I did kind of gloss over that a bit. You do have to kind of watch how you're mounting your motor to the motor mount, because depending on how it's rotated, you could possibly run into an interference problem having your 3 ABC leads hitting the rear brace or just being uncomfortably close to that center drive shaft. So I'm kind of at that point where it's close, but it would have to take a monster hit for it to actually hit it. But I would be more comfortable if it was a little bit more rotated, but in order to do that I would have had to change some other things, but this works out for me. You can choose to flip your ESC. I saw another person that I know have an EB48 2.0, and he flipped his ESC around so that the motor leads are on the outside and the battery leads are on the inside. It looked to be a little bit cleaner that way because everything kind of, I don't know, it's reverse of what this is, but just keep that in mind that you can do it however you want. I'm not the best with wiring, but I do like to do some things for safety. So I'm running a 5mm bullet, and I've made it so that the 5mm positive lead is long for my battery because my positive lead is on the outside, and my negative lead is short so that I cannot reach negative to the inside, positive to the outside. And I mounted my power switch in the middle. 4S LiPo, ready to go. Set your mesh carefully. So it is a plastic spur gear that you get. There is a metal optional. Just you can almost tell by the noise. Always do a full rotation on your spur to get the mesh just right. And there's the universal that I was talking about, that rear universal joint, so that's always connected when you take the center diff out for servicing or changing the oil or tuning it. It's very simple. You don't even have to worry about having that fall off, which is great. Then the body. The body is a bigger version of the 0.4, where it's got that kind of fighter jet look to it. I really like this body style. I have no desire to really change this body style. I really like how these look, and this is the new paint scheme for 2021 that I'm doing by MRC Designs. Miles RC is doing my paint for me. This is a pearl white to a pearl red, but the red is kind of darker back, so it looks more like a blood red with some flame shadowing and stuff. I think it came out quite nice. On track, I wanted to have a lot of white on top so I would still be visible, easier to see, and have it look a little bit more professional on track. Okay, so that's my EB48 2.0. I have been racing it already this season, as mentioned, and it's going well. I haven't got a podium with this yet, but hopefully, maybe in the year I will. I'll be doing the Quebec Classic later this year, and I will be trying to finish out almost every event in the Bego racing series. There's 5 of them. I will show you videos of number 1 after this introduction comes out. You've already seen this running at the J Concepts race. I will say the initial box stock handling, as I built this out to be a box stock setup, it is more, I was going to say tame, but it's easier to drive than the 0.3. I never owned a 0.4. Actually have it right here. The narrower chassis of the 0.3, it was a very agile buggy, but it wasn't always the easiest to drive, and they made the 0.4 where they kind of tamed the front end down a little bit and made it a little bit easier and more consistent to run. And then 2.0 is a significantly wider chassis, and just with all the geometry changes, it is a much more stable buggy. I'll say that that also makes it easier to drive. It's crashing less, and the less you crash, the better you place. So I think that's great. And then if you do want to get it to that like super agile based response of the older style car, you can certainly do that by changing some of the setup of the car. So that's my opinion of it. I'm not a pro racer. I'm an intermediate who runs a YouTube channel, you know, and I appreciate everyone watching and following on based on what I do. So that's where we're at. The only thing I've done since building this out, as I mentioned, I changed the front spring rate. You get a blue spring in the front. For the big track I'm running, I went to a red spring, which is actually, I think, a softer rate. It just tended to make it so that the front end wouldn't bounce. It would now just plant and stick on a big landing. And the other thing was that servo saver adjustment, which is on the front end. You just want to tighten that all the way up and then back it off a quarter of a turn. So we're going to go out and run it that way on the track again this weekend. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. If you're new on here, subscribe. If you want to talk to me, leave a comment down below. And as always, thanks for watching.